Well, welcome to the second in our Russia lecture series. My name is Chris Hayes, and I teach anthropology here, and I am the lectures committee chair. All of these lectures are being recorded, and thanks to West Bend Cable. And the last one's actually, the last week's one is already available on our webpage. And I'm sure this one will be too soon. There is, for those who are, I don't think there are that many of you, but for those, if any students have shown up here, there's a sign-up sheet here for if you're going to get extra credit. I can try to contact the professor, your teacher professor. We do have flyers, which we didn't last week, so please pick up a flyer. And let's see, so one thing to note is that next week's lecture will start at 7:30. Sorry about that, but what's happened, our lecturer, Dr. Karen Evans-Romaine, came up with something that she had to do. It was a faculty meeting and that she had to go to, and at around 5 o'clock or 5:30. So trying to get from Madison to here in that amount of time would not have worked very well. So decided to just go ahead and postpone it to 7:30. But that will be on music and power, and it sounds like what she's described as being, to me anyways, what described it sounds like it'll be a very interesting lecture. And then finally, on March 16th, it's Art and Artifice of Early Soviet Propaganda, and our own Graham Reed, Director of Collections at the MOA, will be talking. And he gave a lecture a couple of years ago on France, when the French series on with the Impressionists, with the seedy side of the Impressionists. And I think he'll be quite a good lecture to finish off with. So, we planned this Russia series 2 years ago. What happened was it kept getting postponed because of COVID. And this is so third time's a charm. Finally, we're able to pull it off here. But we had no idea at the time, how pertinent and relevant this series would be. Tonight's lecture is Public Opinion in Putin's Russia, and they'll be followed by a Q&A, in which I'll be running around with a microphone. Our speaker tonight is Dr. John Reuter. He's a associate professor of political science at UWM. He got his PhD at Emory University, and he studies and teaches about elections, parties, political economy, and political opinion in Russia. He is co-director of the Russian Election Study, which is the longest-running public opinion survey in Russia. In December, they just finished their latest post-election poll. He's published numerous scholarly works, including his 2017 book, The Origins of Dominant Parties, Building Authoritarian Institutions in Post-Soviet Russia. That was published by Cambridge University Press. And so please welcome Dr. Reuter to our campus then.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I have to start this talk with a caveat. This talk was prepared for another community audience about 2 weeks ago, and already about 40% of the material in this talk is completely obsolete. That's the speed with which events are unfolding right now in Russia. Things are changing by the hour in a momentous and grave way. However, I think actually tonight's talk is extremely relevant for the current crisis, because the main topic of tonight's talk is the role of public opinion in Vladimir Putin's Russia, the role that it plays in the political regime there. And through an examination of this topic, what I'm going to try to do is characterize the essential nature of the regime that existed in Russia up until about 72 hours ago. And I think this is important precisely because of how dramatic and rapid the changes that are occurring in Russia are. And what I mean by that is that the opinions that existed in Russia, the attitudes that existed in Russia, those haven't yet had time to be completely remade by Putin's propaganda machine. And so what we're looking at here is something like the state of nature, the status quo in Russian politics on the eve of these momentous events. And so let me tell you a bit about what I want to do. So what I want to start by doing is talking with you a little bit about what kind of regime Russia is. We're going to call it, political scientists call it, an electoral authoritarian regime, and I'll define that term for you. But defining this term is not just an academic exercise, because the nature of the regime determines the role that public opinion plays and determines the underpinnings of regime stability. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to devote special attention to the role and underpinnings of Vladimir Putin's popularity in particular in the stability of this regime. And then we're going to talk for the last, 15 minutes or so of my presentation about the implications of all this for the current crisis in Ukraine. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Russian domestic politics. But in the Q&A, I just want to let you know that for obvious reasons, I'm following events in Russia and Ukraine quite closely, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions about the war or anything related to that. Okay, so let's get started. So the regime that's existed in Russia for the past 20 years is what political scientists call a competitive authoritarian regime. So these are regimes that are defined as regimes where formal democratic institutions are widely seen as the principal means of acquiring and exercising power. So Vladimir Putin, he comes to power through elections. Of course, as we'll get to in a second, those are flawed elections and with a lot of fraud. But nonetheless, that is how he comes to power. He's not installed by a military junta or selected by the Communist Party as in days of old. Elections are the formal means of acquiring and exercising power. However, incumbents violate these rules so often and to such an extent that the regime fails to meet conventional minimal standards of democracy. So these are regimes that they have all the institutional trappings of democracy. Russia has multi-party elections. It has a legislature, a multi-party legislature. It has human rights enshrined in its constitution, stipulated there, much like the United States. It has, on paper, an independent judiciary. If you looked at Russia's system of government on paper, you would conclude, just on the basis of that it's a democracy. But, of course, as I think many of you imagine, Russia's not a democracy. Russia's an autocracy, becoming ever more autocratic by the hour. And the reason, though, for the past 20 years, we don't consider Russia a democracy is because the regime in Russia uses the advantages of, the incumbents use the advantages of their office to create an uneven playing field between the regime and opposition during elections. So elections just aren't free and fair. Now let me spend a bit of time on this, actually, to explain exactly how and why elections are not free and fair, because this is important to understanding what types of things can destabilize the regime in Russia, which is, I think, one of the most important questions in the world right now is what might lead to regime change in Russia. So the first thing to note is that elections in Russia, there is fraud in Russian elections. So here I'm talking about ballot box fraud, that is the stuffing of ballots, the making up of numbers on election day. That occurs. However, it's actually typically much less common than I think many people might think. So for example, in the most recent presidential elections in 2018, Various forensic estimates of ballot fraud in that election range from 1% to 10% of the vote. That's obviously a lot. If we had that much fraud in the US, this would be a major problem. It would be, a big story. But we have to remember that Putin won with 77% of the vote in that election, and the second place candidate received 12%. So even if there had been no ballot box fraud, none of this type of fraud, Putin would have won in a landslide. So this is an important step in understanding the nature of the regime, because what this implies is the regime has to find a way to get people to come to the ballot box. It's not just making up all the numbers. It has to actually mobilize in some way people to vote for it. Now, another crucial element of authoritarianism in Russia is repression. Russia is a repressive regime, a repressive autocracy. It's becoming, this is the element of the regime that is changing very rapidly just in the past few days. But let me talk about what the nature of repression was in Russia up until a few days ago. It was increasingly severe, but a significant amount of political expression was still allowed. Russia was not a regime like China, where all political dissent is essentially banned. There was a significant amount of free expression in Russia, especially on the internet. Then there were free newspapers that would harshly criticize the government. There were free radio stations that would harshly criticize the government. There was a lot of political dissent that was permitted in Russia, and still actually is, even at this moment. That doesn't mean that there wasn't repression in Russia, but it tended to be selective and informal rather than systemic. And what I mean by that is that it's not as if opposition was completely circumscribed, all opposition figures put in jail or banned by law. It's that sometimes, at certain points, the regime would apply selective pressure on select opposition figures, put them in jail, trump up some sort of criminal case against them, in order to send a signal about what the limits of free expression might be. And often also this repression was informal, operate outside the law, be thugs beating up opposition figures or civil society leaders outside their apartments at night, this type of thing. I'm going to skip over this. There's other ways that the regime also subverts elections in a variety of, let's call it, bureaucratic ways. But another very, very important element of any electoral authoritarian regime like Russia is the way that the state controls the flow of information. And here in Russia, we see the hybrid format of the regime very, very clearly. On the one hand, there's direct state control of the major television news outlets, which to this day in Russia is where the vast majority of people get their news. So state television in Russia is highly controlled, highly censored, the content on there is manually directed by the Kremlin. Although I will say in passing, that doesn't mean that it's very boring Soviet-style propaganda. There's very high production value on Russian television. It's very flashy. It's very engaging. Think CNN or Fox News. It has that type of production value and content. At the same time, there is private ownership of smaller outlets and newspapers, and until very recently, the internet was actually quite free in Russia, and there was a lot of free expression on the internet, and you could, if you wanted to in Russia, if you want to go seek out information, criticizing the government or about government malfeasance, corruption, you could do that on the internet. And you can even now, at this moment. We could all get out our laptops and get on the Russian internet and find a lot of free expression. So, this brings me to a crucial point in today's talk, is that the popularity of the regime is crucial in electoral autocracies. These regimes cannot rule through force and through repression and fraud alone. And it's just much easier for these regimes to rule, for their leaders to rule if they are loved, if they are popular. It helps them win elections. It legitimates the regime. If the leader is popular, if Putin is popular, it's much harder for him to claim the legitimate authority to rule and not have to rely on force or lies or deception. Prevents, when the regime is popular, protests, social unrest is less likely. And also, this is more of a political science topic, but it's an important one, When leaders are popular in this regime, they're less likely to experience coups, they're less likely to experience defections by the elites and oligarchs and opinion leaders that surround them and form the basis of their regime. In popular press, accounts often focus on mass unrest as the main threat to authoritarian rule, but what political scientists know is the much more common cause of authoritarian breakdown is schisms within the elite. And the popularity of the leader is very important to maintaining elite unity in these regimes. Luckily for Putin has been extremely popular over the past 20 years. He is, by all accounts, one of the world's most popular politicians. He's been popular ever since the moment he entered office. There's been some oscillations here, and I'll talk about those oscillations in a moment, but the most important message from this graph is that his popularity has never dropped below 60% in his time since office. Now, we can talk about the important question of the extent to which survey respondents in Russia answer questions about whether they support Putin honestly. But suffice to say, actually a lot of my academic research is on this topic, that does happen, but even net of that effect, which we political scientists call preference falsification, Putin is still popular, and it's highly unlikely that less than 50% of the population over most of this period supported Putin, or less than 50% supported Putin. So, okay, I'm not going to go into, for the sake of time, some of the oscillations early in his reign. Just what I want to point out is that even though Putin is still popular, in recent years, since 2018, his popularity has been at one of its lowest points since he's been in office. If you're curious, just an academic side point, that big dip in Putin's popularity that comes in actually 2018, that's not COVID or anything, that's actually a major pension reform that raised the retirement age and people were upset with and dropped his popularity to a kind of a new equilibrium. Now, what I want to do now for the next 10 or so minutes of my talk is talk to you about why Putin is popular, or at least why we survey researchers believe Putin is popular. And this is important because as we turn to the current crisis, we want to think about whether this is the type of event, this war and the increasing repression in Russia, is this type of event that is going to erode his popularity. To understand that, we first need to examine why Putin is popular. So let me start with, and I believe that Putin's popularity rests on 4 pillars. The first pillar I'm going to call intrinsic popularity. And this is reasons that people support Putin that are not that different from the reasons people support this or that politician in a democracy. So for one, surveys show and have shown for a long time that many Russians, not all of course, but many Russians, they have positive views of Putin's character. They like him, they think he has certain positive leadership traits. So surveys show in various quantities that voters view him as smart, competent, professional, honest, serious, and effective. But it's worth noting here briefly that it's not the case necessarily that survey respondents just think Putin has all good traits. So everything is good about him. When you ask respondents whether they think that Putin is the type of leader who thinks about people like them, most people say that they don't think that he's that type of leader. Only about 30% say that, 70% say no. They don't think he's particularly charismatic. Putin is not a particularly charismatic, good public speaker. He's not the type of politician that conveys an image of, I'm the type of guy you want to get a beer with. Rather, though, Russians, they're okay with that. They say, well, but he is competent and he's smart. They view him as smart. This is not a Trump-like figure. He's serious and he knows his stuff. He's a policy wonk, to use an American term. Second, it might surprise you to know that for a lot of Putin's rules, a lot of people support Putin simply because they liked his policy proposals. They liked the position that he occupies in the ideological spectrum, which tends to be slightly right of center, what in the American ideological parlance we would call center-right economically. His support comes from a lot of middle-class voters. He tends to be culturally conservative, although that means something a little different in the Russian context than it does in the American context. And it might shock you to learn that he is perceived as somewhat centrist on foreign policy and in his orientation towards the West. And that is centrist in relation to the Russian political spectrum. So prior to this crisis, there were forces in the Russian political spectrum that were even more antagonistic to the West, that were advocating for an even more aggressive foreign policy approach to the West, and Putin was seen as more centrist. So, to put it in brief, Putin positions himself kind of at the position of what we call the median voter. That is, the position where the most Russians are ideologically. Now, a second really important part of Putin's popularity is what we call performance evaluations. And this is simply the idea that many respondents think that Putin has done a good job governing the country, or that they attribute positive things that have happened in Russia over the past 20 years to his rule. So the clearest example of this, the one that's most often remarked upon, is economic performance. Most of you know, of course, that Russia experienced in the 1990s one of the worst economic depressions that any country has experienced in the 20th century. And then, since then, in the 2000s, in the Putin era, Russia has experienced a dramatic economic resurgence that was particularly pronounced in the 2000s, but then has also continued, at a slower pace in the 2010s. So many Russians credit Putin with restoring the Russian economy. However, I should note, very briefly here, we'll come back to this, that dissatisfaction with the state of the Russian economy has been growing in recent years. The economy has been stagnating and hasn't been growing as fast as it once was. But importantly, it's not on the slide. I want to mention two other points about this performance evaluations issue. The other two major things that Russian respondents credit Putin with is A, restoring political stability in Russia. So there was very high levels of political stability in Russia in the 1990s, and many Russians credit Putin with restoring, in their view, law and order. And the other thing they credit Putin with is increasing Russia's influence in the world, in their eyes, restoring Russia's place of rightful prominence on the world stage. Of course, I hope you all understand, when I'm saying all this, I'm talking about in generalities about those who support Putin. There are many in Russia who don't support Putin, and obviously they don't hold these views. Okay. The third pillar is elite unity, and I've already touched on this. And here, though, we can think of this as a feedback loop. Many of the most prominent elites in Russia, I'm talking about oligarchs, prominent politicians, governors, celebrities, many of these individuals support Putin, both publicly and often privately. But at the same time, because these are influential figures, these are people who, command followings and respect and authority in their region, or maybe if they're an employer among their employees, or if they're an Instagram influencer among their subscribers. Because these people are also influential, their support for Putin boosts Putin's popularity. So there's a mutual dependence between Putin and the elite that is an important part of his popularity and in turn the stability of the regime. The final pillar of his popularity you've probably already thought about, and that's just the point that especially the first two pillars of his popularity are buttressed by the fact that Russia is an authoritarian regime, and information about Putin's character and his personality traits is controlled by state media, and people get a biased view of his performance in office when they watch, for instance, television. And of course, restrictions on the opposition mean that there's not, full-throated, visible criticism of his rule such that his popularity might be dented by that. So, of course, the authoritarian nature of Russia's system helps prop up Putin's popularity. But that does not mean that people's attitudes are not real. They are, in many cases, attitudes that people have. They do support Putin. And in that graph I just showed you, on the eve of this crisis, that was about 65% of Russians. Okay, now let's talk about, I know you guys are all like, okay, when's he going to get to the war? So let's start to move into that realm. So where we were in early 2022 is that Putin's popularity was flagging. And so I think it's true that public sentiment about the war is going to be very important to understanding what happens next in Russia. And we do have evidence that the regime is sensitive to public opinion. I'm not claiming that public opinion constrains Putin or that his moves are dictated by public opinion, but I'm convinced that the Kremlin pays attention to public opinion and is concerned about it and wants to prevent a situation where the vast majority of Russians are opposed to it and its actions. And we know this, I'm not going to go into it, but if you're interested, I can talk about the evidence we have that they're sensitive to this public opinion. Okay, I know there's a lot of numbers up here, so just listen to me and I'll walk you through what's important here. These are numbers from some recent surveys that my team has done, and this is a standard question that we've asked over the years. Actually, I should say I've only become a part of this team for the past 6 years, but my predecessors were asking these questions for decades before this. But one of these standard performance evaluations questions we've asked is, since Putin came to office in 2000, have the following things increased, decreased, or stayed the same? This is just a way to get a sense of whether people think the country is doing better on these metrics, since Putin came to office. This is the standard, Jimmy Carville type, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? That's what we're trying to get at on different metrics. Now, what I just want to emphasize actually is the first two, and maybe we'll just look at the increased row there. So Russia's influence in the world. So like I said, people think that Putin has increased Russia's influence in the world, but recently that number has declined pretty significantly. And the second item there, political stability in Russia, that's declined significantly. So now Putin is almost underwater on that metric that political stability in Russia has increased since he's been in office. Now, let's not worry about freedom of expression, responsive government. Standard of living, Putin was already underwater. More people thought that the standard of living had decreased under Putin than it increased, even back in 2012 and 2016, and that remains the case today. So already on the eve of the crisis, Putin's standing in public opinion was precarious from the perspective of economic evaluations, and where he was still doing well was in the area of foreign policy and in his ability to bring political stability to Russia. This is important because these three things, the economy, political stability in Russia, and Russia's influence in the world, are going to be completely obliterated and devastated by the current crisis. Russia's influence in the world has never been lower since probably the 1990s at this moment today. Political stability in Russia, things are very unstable and uncertain right now in Russia, and Russia's about to experience a financial crisis even greater than the one experienced in 1998. Now, let's talk a little bit about, this is kind of just a going at a bit of a right angle here, but I mean, I'm sure you want to know what surveys say about whether Russians want to go to war in Ukraine. The problem, of course, is that this is a very fast-moving situation. Things are very new, and so we don't have a lot of polls yet. What we do have is some polling from before the war that give us a glimpse into what Russians wanted before the war. So first, let's kind of start with the big question of whether Russians, want to annex Ukraine. This maybe a maximalist potential aim of Putin. Surveys show that at least before the war, this was not the case. Universally, there was not strong support in society for saying, at least in this question formulation, that Ukraine and Russia should be one state. And that number, 18%, it bounced around a bit, 20%, 15%, but it's been in that range for 2 decades. And it should be noted, however, that that's a very different situation than Crimea. So with Crimea, surveys did show prior to the annexation of Crimea that Russians thought of Crimea as maybe a part of Russia. I can talk about that, but there's a series of historical and cultural and ethnic reasons why Russians would have a different view about Crimea than Ukraine as a whole, and indeed Ukrainians might have a different view about Crimea than Ukraine as a whole. So the basic point here, I'm very certain we can conclude. There's not a lot that we can conclude for certain about the war right now, but one thing I feel very comfortable concluding is that the impetus to this did not come from the bottom up, such like the Russian, not all, the Russian people were demanding annexation of Crimea. That's not what's happening. I'm quite confident of that. We can also see from a question, something similar from our survey in December 2021. Now remember, the crisis was nowhere near this hot at that time, and it was a very different type of crisis when we were talking about this conflict in Ukraine. At that time, we're really just talking about the frozen conflict, the low-intensity war that was going on in the Donbass region. But when you asked respondents at that time, what should Russia do about this low-intensity conflict, only 8% thought we should send in the troops to fight with the separatists in the Donbass. In fact, only 9% then which said that they thought they should arm the separatists. So again, it's not at all clear to me that the impulse to war is coming from the Russian public. Interestingly as well, this shocks audiences that don't follow this. The Russian public doesn't tend to think that Russia's relations with the West, again, this is all in the eve of war, and everything's changing by the minute. Russia's relations with the West should be inimical or even adversarial. I have to apologize, these bars are probably switched. It would make more sense if we had ally here and rival here. But what you see is that very small percent, only about 7% of respondents, this is again in December of 2021, said that they thought Russia should treat the West as an enemy. It's true, a sizable chunk, about 35% said that they should treat the West as a rival, but the modal response is that to treat the West as an ally. Almost 50% and even 15% said as a friend. It's noteworthy that before the crisis, in Putin's own rhetoric, I know it seemed as if, and it is true, that relations between Russia and the West were tense before the current war, and they were, but nonetheless, when Putin in public statements would refer to European countries or the US, he would call them partners. It doesn't really mean ally in Russian, but it certainly doesn't mean enemy. Now, this all comes with one giant caveat. Public opinion in Russia is malleable. Public opinion is malleable in any setting. Of course, it's influenced by the media, it's influenced by opinion leaders, it's influenced by elite cues. It's especially malleable in Russia, given the state's control over much of the information environment, especially, like I said, on television. And so it could be the case, and it very well may end up being the case, that Putin is able to, or we shouldn't say Putin, the Kremlin and their propaganda machine is able to pull Russian public opinion in this direction, such that all these numbers change, and there's, people are frothing at the mouth, demanding that we annex Ukraine and that we confront NATO immediately. That's possible. And there are some indications, let me put it this way, that I'll tell you the indications that that could be possible. One is that everything I showed you here is accurate and true. These are numbers those are facts. At the same time, in those same surveys, it's still true that most Russians, the vast majority of Russians, were blaming NATO for the current crisis, not Russia. So, and that was the narrative that was pressed on state television: is NATO is ginning up this conflict. NATO is creating these problems, is trying to encircle Russia. And so large shares of respondents in our surveys did say that they thought NATO would weaken Russia if the president doesn't stand up to them, doesn't stand up to NATO. So NATO in particular, which is a stand-in for just the West as a military entity, Russians do view that as a threat. And of course, we also have to remember that what happened in Russia, in Russian public opinion, after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, there was this massive rally around the flag effect. Public opinion shifted dramatically in favor of Putin, shifted dramatically towards support for what Russia was doing. And so it is possible public opinion could shift quite rapidly in Russia. There are some reasons. I'm going on a bit long, so I don't want to go into them. I can talk about Q&A. There's some reasons why I think this is quite different than Crimea and why it's going to be much harder this time to shift public opinion towards supporting war or confrontation with the West like they did in 2014, but I can get to that maybe in Q&A. Finally, I just added this 45 minutes, whatever, an hour ago before I came here, because these surveys are just coming out literally minutes ago. But we're getting now finally the very first surveys from Russian polling firms asking specifically about people's support for the current war in Ukraine. And so this is a survey that was carried out February 26th through 28th. Interestingly, though, now we're into the nitty-gritty. That's before the full financial consequences of the sanctions became apparent on Monday. So people at this time would just be reacting to the early stages of what Russia calls the special military operation in Ukraine. 73% supported recognizing the independence of the Donbass regions, and 58% said they supported the military activities of Russia in Ukraine. That number, I think there's a lot of ways to interpret that number. One could interpret this as a really high number because prior to this, as I just showed you, prior to the start of this war, there didn't seem to be a lot of demand for the war, and we might be alarmed by the fact that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, 58% of Russians, after just 3 days of propaganda war, are supportive of the war. On the other hand, I'm quite certain in the new political environment that exists in Russia in the past week that preference falsification in surveys has probably gone through the roof. And I would expect, I have no evidence of this, but my expectation is at least 20% of that number is fake, is not real. It's people saying, yes, I support the war, I don't want to risk getting in trouble. Another way of kind of positive spin on that number is that given how repressive the environment in Russia has become, it's shocking that you might interpret this as saying, it's shocking that 42% of respondents would be willing to say, no, I'm opposed to the war publicly. So that's very early impressions of those survey numbers. But that's all I have for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about Russian domestic politics or the current crisis. Actually, that's it. That's all I'm going to answer questions
about. I've been reading a lot about Russia, and after World War II, the soldiers were taken back to Russia and placed in gulags and treated very poorly. Are those gulags still in existence?
No. Russian, no.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm actually a PhD candidate who works on Russia. I'm in anthropology, and I've spent a lot of time in the North Caucasus
Okay.
prior to the pandemic. I have actually 3 questions, 2 specific, actually all of them are based on your presentation. The first is, do you think that this will result in systemic repression, so a shift, also based on, elite loyalty? Will we see more cracking down now? Because perhaps elite loyalty, we're starting to see the first oligarchs, defecting or at least making statements in public, which is rather rare for Russia, against the war, as well as some prominent journalists and a few people. And the second question, which may be a little bit difficult to answer, is how coup-proof is Russia?
What?
Coup-proof, a military coup. Yeah.
Not cuckoo.
No, not cuckoo. And then thirdly, there's been a lot of on kind of social media apps, videos of Russian soldiers being detained and questioned, and told to call their parents, and that's been sent back to kind of Russia, and through Russian media channels. A lot of Russians are really on social media sites like WhatsApp, Telegram, all these other things. Do you think that will have any sort of major effect, or is starting to have effects on public opinion at all? Thank you.
Great questions, yeah. So the first one's easy to answer. Absolutely, in fact, we don't have to speculate about this because we're already seeing it. In my talk, and when I talked about the information environment, I qualified everything by saying, well, there is a lot of free expression that's possible on certain independent outlets. Just in the past 48 hours, the largest independent the largest independent television station and radio station have been taken off the air. They're slowing down Twitter. It's harder to access Twitter. Scores of opposition newspapers have been blocked on the internet. This doesn't mean there's a total information blackout. People can still access social media. You can access a lot of this stuff through VPNs, and the Russian government hasn't gotten around yet to figure out how to get around that. But it's already just becoming much harder. There's been protests against the war in Russia, which we can talk about. They've been pretty large for the past few years when protest activity has been pretty low. But there have been a lot of protesters detained. So 6,500 protesters have been detained thus far. And so the environment's becoming extremely repressive and even the nature of the regime has started to change. So as I noted, the nature of repression in Russia has tended to be, up until this point, informal and non-systematic. It's becoming more systematic. So for instance, they've passed a law called a military censorship law that stipulates up to a 15-year prison term for spreading fake information about the war. So that can be interpreted broadly, and it's going to, of course, have a major chilling effect on coverage of the war. How coup-proof is Russia? That's a broad question. I guess it depends on what you mean by a coup. If you're thinking about like a traditional military coup, then Russia's not particularly coup-proofed in the way we usually think about regimes being coup-proofed, with highly divided security apparatuses and these kind of loyalist presidential guards and things like this, because Russia traditionally doesn't have a politically involved military. So typically, to the extent that Russia's leaders have worried about threats to their security, it's not typically come from the regular military. However, I think a much more plausible scenario for regime breakdown in Russia would be what we call a palace coup. So this would be elites around him saying, enough is enough, and just, telling him in a room like this, sorry, Vladimir Vladimirovich, but you're not in power anymore. That, I think, is one of the more likely scenarios for regime breakdown. Your last question about the conscripts, I think this is the thing that they're probably worried about more than any other thing on the planet right now, is specifically this issue causing a shift in public opinion. There's a lot of conscripts in the Russian army. Most of them, it seems, did not know they were actually going to invade Ukraine until the order was given to invade Ukraine. And if many of them start dying, I think their family members are not going to be dissuaded by repression, by riot police from going onto the streets, from protesting. We also know that one of the few interest groups, one of the few social movements that has ever stood up to Putin and caused him to back down was an interest group called the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers that was quite active during the Second Chechen War, and they organized successfully and were able to secure concessions on their demands from the Putin government during that time. And so I think they're very concerned about this.
Thank you for the interesting and relevant talk. I saw one article in the New York Times about 2 new NATO missile bases, one in Poland and one in Romania, a couple of weeks ago, which seemed to precipitate a lot of this. And I haven't seen any other news reporting about it. Has that been used as justification in Russia for this invasion?
I have to say I don't know exactly what you're referring to. If you're referring to, if you're referring to anti-ballistic missile installations, is that what you're referring to? I mean, that has been a sore spot in U.S.-Russia relations for the past 10 years. Going back to, I forget what year, 2002, I think, when the United States pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, which had been one of the cornerstone treaties of strategic nuclear stability in the Soviet period. And the U.S. pulled out of it and started developing more of its anti-ballistic missile capacity. And yeah, so Russia's been complaining about that for a long time. The argument being that that upsets the strategic balance and makes Russia feel unsafe. That's their argument. Now, the U.S. retort, whether it's accurate or not, I'm not an expert on this type of stuff, is that it's not capable of defeating either the types of nuclear warheads that Russia has or the number of them. It's directed more at a singular strike from a rogue state like North Korea or Iran. And again, that's what the U.S. says. Now, the extent to which this precipitated this, I'm sure this one thing certainly did not precipitate it, because there's a lot of other things going on, mostly related to Ukraine and Ukrainian domestic politics. But it is true that this kind of military expansion by NATO into Eastern Europe is one of the, at least public, grievances that Russia keeps coming back to as justification for what it's doing.
Where are they putting all these prisoners? Do they still have gulags? Do they put them in no, I'm just looking for a location. Are they doing that?
Well, that's kind of the point. This isn't like the Soviet Union under Stalin. There's not that many prisoners, right? Because you're talking about political prisoners, I presume. Yeah, there's not that many such. And I mean, to be clear, maybe you're keying off my response about the protesters they arrested, the 6,500. They're not put into some sort of long-term detention. They're held. The goal is to get them off the streets. They're held in local jail overnight and then released the next morning. They pay a fine of about $75.
Thank you. It wasn't clear.
Yeah.
I think you can probably hear me.
Just dive in, yeah.
But nobody else can.
Okay. Thank you. I was just wondering your opinion on how his background with the KBG has influence on his behavior today.
I don't know. I mean, it could, let me just put it this way. There's different schools of thought. Some people view that as determinative, and that's, that he developed this kind of conspiratorial worldview when he was part of the KGB, and that he was also kind of conditioned in the KGB to have a repressive mindset. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But at the same time, there's lots of oligarchs and political leaders in Russia who are in the KGB, and they didn't turn out to be particularly bad guys necessarily. And I don't think we usually think that necessarily the same way in the U.S. Like anyone who was ever in the CIA, I mean, George Bush Sr. was director of the CIA, and it's rare that people analyze George Bush Sr.'s presidency through the lens of, well, he was CIA director, and therefore he's, has these character traits. So there's different schools of thought among Russia watchers as to the extent to which that matters. So, yeah. I've seen your hand here for a bit.
I was wondering if you could speak to this guy Navalny and if you have any sense of public support for Navalny and why he seems to have been repressed pretty distinctly and harshly. And if I understood you correctly, you're saying there's like a 10% fewer votes for Putin, or less support. So maybe I'm mixing it up, but if Navalny had run against him openly, just speculatively, what kind of support would he have had? Is he really that big of a threat? Why does he have to be repressed so distinctly?
So, so Navalny is the most prominent leader of what we call the non-system opposition in Russia. This is the opposition that's not allowed to run in elections, and that kind of their only way that they can express their grievances is through street protests and YouTube videos and social media and stuff like that. We distinguish that type of opposition from what we call the systemic opposition. This is like the Communist Party and several other parties in Russia, that they have seats in the Duma, they run in elections, and they're allowed to run. And they, in exchange for their relative, but not total quiescence, they're allowed to run in these elections. Navalny is strident and uncompromising in his opposition. He's a very principled person, a very courageous person. It's not clear, what's definitely clear is that the regime viewed him as the most potent threat to their rule because of the size of the protests that he and his movement could potentially mobilize, largely on grievances surrounding corruption. For all of Putin's popularity, most Russians are dissatisfied with the level of corruption in the government, the use of public office for private gain. So they were very concerned about Navalny. That's why they tried to kill him, they tried to poison him, and then they imprisoned him. And also in retrospect, it may be the case that they put Navalny in jail because they knew they were planning on launching an invasion, that they didn't want a potent protest leader out there if they're going to be launching an invasion. To your counterfactuals, I can distinguish two different counterfactuals and answer both of them. One counterfactual would be, what would have happened if Navalny had run in the current system, the current electoral authoritarian system? That question we can answer. He would have lost. About 14% of Russians in surveys say they support Navalny. Maybe it's a little bit more because people are afraid, but I'd say not that much more. So in the current system, he would have lost. Now, if we envision a kind of total counterfactual where it's a free and fair election, there are no constraints on the opposition, there are no constraints on the media, it's anybody's guess. My guess is actually neither of them would be the two main candidates. It'd be somebody completely different, because both of these individuals now, they're kind of a product of this particular system. Putin, the reason Putin exists and still popular is because he's able, because he relies on this repressive authoritarian apparatus. And Navalny, even though he's popular in this particular system, he's kind of a grating individual. I don't think in a pure democracy he would rise to the top. I think he would be outshone by a more polished politician.
I know China is communist, definitely. Is Russia communist? Do they follow Lenin at all, or?
No, not anymore. No.
Not anymore?
No. No.
Thank you for your presentation. How accurate is reporting on the invasion into Ukraine reported back to the population for public opinion? I heard today was the first report of any fatalities and injuries in the war, and how broad is that across the nation?
It's not accurate at all. it's at least on state-controlled media, it's a complete through-the-looking-glass parallel universe that's presented on state media. And I want to emphasize that's a break with the past. The state media has always been offered a skewed view of world events happening in Russia, but never before have they been so bold as to try to offer their viewers a complete parallel, non-existent reality about current events. And so what I mean by this is, A, Russia doesn't even admit really there's a war going on. What you see when you watch state television in the evening is they're talking about the conflict just in the Donbass, and they're talking about the Ukrainians shelling the separatist fighters there, and the Russian forces, and the human rights abuses that the Ukrainians are committing. And there's no coverage whatsoever of the airstrikes in the rest of Ukraine or the conflict going on there. They admit that they're carrying out what they call a special military operation, but their view of it is they're just doing surgical strikes against select military targets, right? And that that's all they're admitting. They're not reporting true, almost certainly not reporting true casualty figures. I have no idea what the real casualty figures are, but the number they reported today is 498, and it has to be higher. However, one should note that you can still in Russia access any amount of information you want. If you want to sit down at your computer or on your smartphone and find out what's going on in Ukraine, there's a gazillion videos from, on social media platforms that you can access. And there are, if you know where to find them, free and independent newspapers and news sites that are going to tell you what's going on. All that's available on the internet. It's just if you take the time and energy to go seek that information out.
How many people have access to internet?
It's very high now. It's probably a little lower than the U.S., but smartphones just changed everything. So like even if you're in a village with no hardwired internet, you have a smartphone. So the question is use of internet. Russia's an increasingly aged population, and many of them, especially in far-flung areas, they may have access. They have a phone they're going to text their grandchildren on, but they're not, spending a lot of time on TikTok or Instagram or these, and so, yeah.
I was wondering, what is the population of Russia, and what do Russians do for work? Is there a lot of manufacturing that goes on in Russia, and who do they trade with, basically?
So you're maybe the Russian. What is the main basis of the Russian economy? So the population is 145 million, thereabouts 143, something like that. The main stay of the Russian economy is the export of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and then after that, it's other types of raw materials, minerals, and then also exports of machinery and things like that. But it's an advanced industrial economy. For domestic consumption, there's lots of manufacturing, making whatever, toothbrushes and slippers and all that sort of stuff. However, Russia is deeply integrated into the global economy, and it depends might not be the right word, but they import lots of stuff. They don't make their own smartphones. They don't make any, Snickers. There's no Snickers that's being made in Russia. They have their own candy bars. My point is that there's lots of things they're getting through their connections to global supply chains, and what's happened in the past 72 hours is they've been almost entirely cut off from Western products. This is unprecedented. It's not really due to it's only in part due to the sanctions. The sanctions are affecting the Russian financial sector, their ability to borrow money, and the ability of their banks to make transfers with the West. But what's unprecedented and no one foresaw happening is this boycott by Western companies on doing trade with Russia. So there's lots of companies, everything from Boeing to BMW to Ford to Mars candy bars to almost every Western company has said they're going to stop doing business with Russia. And that's going to have absolutely cataclysmic consequences for the Russian economy. And it's quite scary because maybe it'll lead to very rapid regime change, or maybe it could lead to an embittered, an isolated population of Russians who feels that their very existence is under threat and therefore drastic measures are justified.
Thank you for sharing. You pretty much answered most of my question that I had just in that last bit. But I was hoping if you could expand on the impact of SWIFT and like with baking and just kind of if you could extrapolate a little bit more about those economic consequences that potentially could happen.
Yeah, sure. I actually don't know all of the details here, but in terms of the banking sector, there's two types of sanctions that are of relevance. One is what they call blocking sanctions on banks. So this just prevents you or me from going and taking out an investment in a Russian bank, and also prevents Russian banks from taking out loans, taking out money from the American financial system. The second, SWIFT, is just a clearing system for banks. It's just a way they communicate with each other to make instantaneous money transfers. That's actually not something the US controls. It's kind of controlled by a consortium of Western countries. And those actually haven't gone into effect yet. They've been discussing exactly which banks would be sanctioned with that. And so that's been something that everyone knows is in the works for the past few days, but it hasn't gone into effect yet. But this is important when it does happen because it's not, well, for two reasons. One, this obliterates the ability of the Russian government to borrow money. If it needs to raise, well, at least to borrow money from the West. They can still borrow money from China, or Chinese banks, or Indian banks, or a few other countries, but they can't borrow money in the West anymore. So that's going to make it much harder for them to finance things like paying pensions, the war, especially because the United States and other Western allies did something unprecedented, which was seize much of Russia's dollar reserves. They stole it. They stole it. They took it. I mean, maybe it's justified, and maybe I think it might be, but they did steal it. And so Russia doesn't have these reserves to pay the pensions, to pay salaries of soldiers, or whatever else they need to do to whatever else the government needs to do. So that puts the Russian government in a very precarious, potentially in a very precarious financial situation. But the second element of that is that let's say that I am a Western company and I haven't gone so far yet as to decide that I'm exiting the Russian market, but I want to enter the Russian market or stay in the Russian market. Say I'm Coca-Cola. I actually don't know if they've exited the Russian market. And if I'm deciding whether I'm going to keep doing business in Russia, this is highly risky because it's going to be very hard to make payments to Russia. We're talking about large flows of cash. How are you going to just do basic business when you can't have access to the Russian financial system? And it's just a lot of uncertainty for these businesses. So a lot of businesses are deciding, we don't know what's going to happen with the Russian financial system, with the Russian banking system, so we're just not going to mess with it. We're just going to leave Russia.
The Donetsk region there, is there anything strategically valuable there that both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, are fighting the separatists and stuff there?
The Donbass?
Yeah.
It is a mining region, and there's a lot of heavy industry there, but the conflict's not over that. It's not over economic resources.
Do they want to be a separate country or something? Or do they want to join Russia?
So the separatists in the Donbass, that's a really kind of long story, but when this whole affair started out in 2014, there was a sentiment, and there still is, but at that time there was a sentiment among people living in that part of Ukraine that they didn't want to be a part of a Ukraine that was going to become more integrated into the West economically, politically, and culturally, and that they felt closer to Russia. That is true. At the same time, the armed separatist movement there was not homegrown. It was really kind of funded and propped up by the Russians, and it continues to be like that today. Public opinion now in the Donbass is, just a product of the highly repressive regime they've been living under since then, right? And so it's hard to know what, their attitudes would really be in the absence of what this, of this conflict and the occupation they've been, under. So, yeah, but recognizing them as an independent country, that's not a long-term solution to what's going on there. That's just kind of part of the political games that Russia's playing and to continue with the.
So as Putin seems to be driven more and more into a corner, are there safeguards for, say, nuclear codes? I mean, can he just decide one day I'm going to push the button, or is there some sort of, safeguarding?
There's no formal safeguard, just the same as, and so it's not as if there's someone else who has to turn the key at the same time. There may be, just like there might be in this country, there may be informal safeguards. There may be, if I don't know, we could speculate maybe that maybe there would be someone around him who might stop him if he wanted to do that. I should preface everything I'm saying, I don't think Putin has lost his mind or he's a madman at this point. But what I will say to your point is that the reason that this is, I think, one of the most, if not the most dangerous time since World War II is that this is very different than the Cold War and the Soviet period when there was collective leadership in the Soviet Union. So after Stalin, the leadership of the Soviet Union was collective. It was the Politburo. And if you had one general secretary that was doing something the rest of the Politburo members didn't like, then they would remove him, as did happen with Khrushchev in the 1960s. And so, there was less risk that you'd have one individual that might go crazy and do something unpredictable because, we could have more confidence that at least this collective of people is unlikely to lose their minds simultaneously. So that's what makes it dangerous, particularly dangerous. I think we should take it very seriously.
I got on a website, Moscow something. I got on a website, it's called Moscow something, and they were showing the actual protests in Moscow and what was going on there. Can you recommend a website like, it's Moscow something? Can you recommend a website that would do that? They were actually showing the protests.
So you want a recommendation for something to follow for good information about what's happening in Russia, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
The Moscow Times is an English language newspaper in Moscow that is really quite good. I would recommend that, yeah. I mean, it's primarily for expats living in Moscow, which actually there's quite a few of until recently, and so it's very good. I would also recommend in English, there's a site called Meduza that has an English page, and it's at Meduza. It's a independent Russian news site that's based in Latvia, and they have an English version.
So I also have another question, and it's regarding more of the ethnic angle. So you are seeing, for example, in Ukraine now, where you have these sort of foreign people coming in, foreigners who have been asked to help fight, if they choose to, in Ukraine against Russia. And you are seeing, Chechens, for example, from Kadyrov's Chechnya coming, and on the other hand, you're seeing diaspora Chechens from outside, from Europe, other places, who are seeing it almost as their sort of, desire to fight against Kadyrov Chechens in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what possibly the effects of this might also be ramifications for kind of ethnic cleavages in Russia itself, especially in sort of autonomous regions.
Yeah. I have to preface this by saying this is not my particular area of expertise, ethnic relations in Russia. In general, ethnic groups or ethnic minorities have been quiescent relatively over the past 20 years in Russia. In the 1990s, there were a lot of separatist movements, and those have died down significantly. I will say, however, that there was a highly unpopular law on the teaching of minority languages in Russia in, well, you probably know better than me, 2018, right? And this proved unpopular, and you can actually demonstrate, you can see in the electoral results that, not a ton, but Putin and his party lost ground among certain ethnic minorities that were affected by that law. So there are latent grievances there that could potentially be activated by this. I mean, I've often, now I'm just kind of speculating and speaking kind of personally, but I've wondered why, there's not, Kadyrov or someone like him wouldn't take this opportunity to make a sovereignty claim in Chechnya. Because the entire Russian army is in Ukraine right now. What are they going to do? But you could see things like that happening, but it's all going to happen at once. We're not going to know exactly that it's going to happen until it's already happening, because everyone's queuing off each other, and as soon as it looks like the regime's unraveling, that's when you're going to start to see all that stuff happening, whether it's oligarchs defecting or Kadyrov seizing the moment, or some other ethnic groups, Tatarstan making sovereignty claims.
A couple of the other questions sparked a curiosity in me. Could you possibly comment on Russian public opinion towards China and whether or not these economic sanctions could align the economies of Russia and China in the future?
I can't comment. Actually, I really don't know much about Russians' attitudes towards China, so I'll probably mess something up if I comment on that. But on the second question, we don't have to speculate, because the Russian government has been very explicit about, we're just going to import more stuff from China. We'll put more of our reserves into China. So undoubtedly, this is going to lead to more economic dependency of Russia on China. There's not going to be, just one silly example, Apple's pulled out of Russia. There's not going to be more iPhones in Russia, so Russia's going to get iPhones from somewhere. China, not iPhones, smartphones. They're going to get them from China. But that takes time. You can't just overnight, make contracts and start up all this trade. And so there's going to be this period between when these sanctions hit, when there's all these Western companies boycotting Russia, and when Russia is able to completely kind of reorient its economy towards China and the developing world. And that intermediate period is where things are going to get very bad in Russia and scary.
All right, well, let's see. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and remember, next week's lecture is at 7:30, and the final one will be back at the original time at 6:30. And thank you very much for a very informative lecture and a very long Q&A session. It was also